Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special video on the Jams and Tea channel. I like to do these videos, Jake and I both like to do these videos from time to time, where we talk about an artist that one of us particularly loves and work our way through those records, counting them down, ranking them essentially from our least favorite to our most favorite. And though the title worst to best, maybe to some people implies some kind of laissez-faire approach to evaluating art, these are all records that I like to varying degrees, and M83 have been one of my favorite artists ever since I was a kid. In fact, the impetus for me doing this video is the mere fact that they were such a huge part of me getting into music, of my coming of age, as corny as that can sound, and it's certainly a concept that applies to the music that M83 made in very corny, but also very truthful and fair ways. I think when you think about what this band tries to do, the sort of emotions that they try to evoke. When I discovered this band as a kid, they spoke to me. They've continued to speak to me, and their larger than life sound, as well as their dedication to these kind of beautiful, often overwhelming atmospheric rushes of texture, have always informed what I look for in music and in art, and has spoken to me in very personal ways. So I'm really looking forward to counting down all 8 of their albums to date. Another reason why, of course, I'm doing this is that if you're an M83 fan, or if you're just in the know, you may have heard that they have a new record coming out in March called Fantasy, the 9th M83 album, which we will be reviewing on the Jams and Tea podcast. Really excited to do that. Really excited to see where in his artistic trajectory Anthony Gonzalez is. And of course, on that note, for anyone who's not super familiar, if you haven't listened to a lot of the M83 music, or if you don't know much about the project, this video is for you as well, because I'm going to walk you through their records. I'm going to explain what M83 are, what they're all about, what you need to know about their records to get an idea of whether you would enjoy them or not, and why they mean so much to me. So, without further ado, let's get started. M83 were formed in 1999 in France in Antibes by Anthony Gonzalez and Nicolas Fromageau, I think. Forgive me if I'm saying those names wrong. They were initially partners in early proto sort of post-rock shoegaze bands that were very much influenced by projects like Ride, like My Bloody Valentine, like Sigur Rós, who came up around the same time as well as this band. And M83 as a project from early on worked within a toolkit of instrumental palettes, of sounds that came to define a lot of what was popular with blogs in the 2000s. So a lot of the sounds and techniques and styles that M83 traded in would come to be quite popular across the 2000s in bands like Hot Chip, and further on in bands like Passion Pit, for instance. They of course didn't pioneer the use of electronics and distorted electronics in the context of a shoegazy sort of sugar rush pop song framework, and indeed they don't really show much interest in pop song frameworks for a decent amount of their early career at all. But it's very clear from the halcyon days of M83 that this is a band that are seeking to evoke big emotions, that are seeking to evoke feelings that will be familiar to all of us, that will kindle and sort of resonate with a particular nostalgia that we feel for the earliest days of our life, for the periods of growing up that defined so much of who we were. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, because the first 2 projects I want to talk about, the least essential M83 projects, but I think ones that still give you an insight into the sorts of feelings that Anthony Gonzalez in particular seeks to create, are the ambient records that he made, specifically Digital Shades Volume 1 in 2007 and Digital Shades Volume 2 in 2019. I'm going to lump these together at the bottom of the list. They are, of course, less essential than the other M83 projects, purely by virtue of being less fully realized records in the sense that the other albums are, and more just collections of ambient atmospheres, soundscapes, explorations of texture that are structured into the album format, but very much function as a bit of an exploration in between more fully realized projects. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Anthony Gonzalez doesn't view it that way. I'm sure he probably considers these records to be fully formed, fully fledged statements, you know, as significant to him as records like Hurry Up We're Dreaming and Before the Dawn Heals Us. But this is just the way that I see it. The weaker of the two is definitely the first one, which is the more insubstantial as well. It has some pleasant enough textural explorations. It has some decent, nice, very simplistic melodies. These are all aspects of every M83 record, right? You have these gorgeous, little, beautiful synthesized melodies that don't add up to much in and of themselves, but land with this certain impact and just intensity and power when they are given the weight that Anthony typically gives them on the Folsom records. But they don't have that here. You're more or less getting, often, in fact, maybe almost always, percussionless explorations of very, very simplistic melodies, and often sometimes more just texture than melody completely. Some songs like The Highest Journey, the closing track on this record, or Coloring the Void, for instance, have these very simplistic, repetitive looping melodies, often on piano, but that's really all you have to it. There's generally this kind of slowly increasing intensity that makes it all feel very sort of fuzzy and very sort of poignant in its own way, but it doesn't really pull from the full toolkit. Neither does Digital Shades Volume 2, which I will give some credit, is a much more texturally diverse record than Digital Shades Volume 1. In fact, they feel like very much separate projects despite the naming connection. You don't really need to hear Digital Shades Volume 1 to appreciate all of what Anthony Gonzalez is trying to do with Volume 2. They are obviously made 12 years apart, so what Anthony is bringing to the table with Volume 2 is definitely the product of more experience, more budget, more experimentation, a better understanding of how to layer and relate instruments into his mixes, but also, most crucially, one of the most pivotal partnerships in the entire history of M83, essentially. Now, you'll notice that early on I mentioned that this band started out as a duo initially with Anthony and Nicolas Fromager. That didn't last very long. Nicolas is only in the first two M83 albums, to my knowledge, and left shortly after that to pursue other endeavors. And ever since then, it's essentially been Anthony's solo project with a rotating round table of guests who often do recur from album to album. But aside from Nicolas, the biggest collaborator in M83, and this is a collaboration that really kicked off more in the 2010s, is Justin Meldal-Johnson, the former bass player turned production extraordinaire, who's responsible for many of the best sounding guitar and electronic records of the 2010s in terms of a production behind the boards standpoint. The contributions of Justin are certainly a huge part of what make Digital Shades Volume 2 feel like so much more of an interesting record and so much more of a fully realized vision than Digital Shades Volume 1, which was more of a curiosity. You get more overt influence of projects like Tangerine Dream and some of the more classical progressive electronica of the 70s on Digital Shades Volume 2. That comes through very strongly in opening track Hell Risers, and also in later songs on the records like Colonies, which is just this beautiful, very subtle piece that I love. Feelings, Lune de Fiel, a deep cut favorite of mine, Oh Yes You're There Every Day, which is one of the few tracks on the record that has a really strong melodic presence, and the epic, quote-unquote, but very beautiful and plaintive closer, Temple of Sorrow, which was the lead single for the record. Digital Shades Volume 2 is certainly inessential, and it's not something I would remotely recommend someone who wants to get an idea of what M83 are all about and why they're so beloved. But if you are looking for a very straightforward but fulsome and well-constructed ambient record with no frills whatsoever, I would recommend giving this one a shot. And if you're interested in getting into M83, keep it in your back pocket for later down the line. If the production of Justin Meldal-Johnson and the sorts of interests in terms of atmospheric stylings that Anthony explores interest you, go and check this out after that. However, with the Digital Shades projects out of the way, I want to count down the 6 M83 albums proper. And at number 6, we start with Now, this feels like an obvious choice for the bottom of the ranking proper because it's the most rudimentary record that Anthony and Nicholas made. It's very lo-fi, it's recorded straight to 8-track. It has very cheap technology involved within it. Now, and obviously those are things that can be used to create a very endearing experience and a kind of childlike feel. Smartly, Anthony and Nicholas know how to use the technology that they have to its best strengths and to create a record that is very evocative, that absolutely establishes clearly an identity for what M83 are going to be in terms of the themes that they're interested in terms of the feelings that they want to evoke. And you can get a sense of this before you even hit play on the album, because all of the tracks of the record, when read in order, actually form a short story, a very short story, but give you initially a strong picture of a scene at which the music on this album might be playing. And so before you even hit play, if you notice that, then you have a sense for what you're going to experience. It's very hazy, it's very dreamlike, it is very childlike in certain points. The melodies can be very simplistic and very sort of naive feeling, but the distortion of the lo-fi technology that's used as well as the recording process gives them an edge that I really appreciate. Obvious highlights are the second track, first track proper, Night, which is one of the most maximalist pieces on here, really shows their preponderance for these building intensifying electric pieces that definitely borrow a lot from post-rock. You also have tracks like Sitting, which has this sort of racing video game feel where it's just kind of looping over and over again, but it's loud and it's fast and it makes you feel as though you're constantly in motion. Violet Tree is one of the more sort of emotive pieces on the record, this simple kind of twinkling melody that's explored as these atmospherics get layered into it. I'm particularly fond of some of the more subtle moments on this record, like the gorgeous and peaceful caresses, as well as the Buffalo 66 sampling I'm Getting Closer, which has these very fascinating percussive choices that feel as though they're kind of predicting conventions of trap music, except over 10 years early. One of the other strengths of this record as well is that it understands how to use interludes well to bridge between longer pieces, but also to have their own sense of identity and feel as though they're worth experiencing rather than just bogging down the track list. Now, that's not to say every single interlude on here is great, but tracks like My Face and Staring at Me in particular are really evocative. In fact, My Face might even be one of my favorite pieces on the entire record. It just has this achingly sad melody that I find kind of visiting me at unexpected moments. In fact, this is probably the best thing I can say about M83's self-titled record, is that there are these moments where the feeling that you get from the way a particular texture lands and the way a particular melody is colored really does leave an impression on you, even if a lot of the pieces here aren't really greater than the sum of their parts. There's definitely moments on this album that meander far too much, like Facing That and She Stands Up. But still, with the exception of a couple of moments such as the brutal Kelly, the album is still a fairly easy listening experience, and particularly in its back half kind of settles into a space that's almost luxurious and you can almost relax to it. The self-titled M83 record is also definitely not where I would recommend you begin unless you're concretely planning to listen to every album in order, which I do encourage if you feel like you can commit that. But if you're looking for a good starting point, I wouldn't recommend this. It has a lot of kitschy, nostalgic joy, but a lot of its best strengths and attributes are things they would go on to do better on subsequent records. Number 5. Saturdays equals Youth. I kind of can't believe that I'm putting this album on the list already. You know, even though there's not very many albums on this ranking, it still feels like surprisingly low for an album like this. And I'll explain why. I mean, for starters, this was one of the first, I think it actually was the first M83 album that I heard as a kid, and this was not that long after it came out as well. I was about 11, 12 years old, kind of the perfect age to be kind of taken in by the starry-eyed wonder of this album, and it is one of their most accessible records too. It's definitely the most accessible they had made up to this point in their career. And a lot of that appeal really resonated with me to the point where for a long time, this was my favorite M83 album album and one of my favorite albums ever. And it's certainly not that my enjoyment of it has significantly taken a fall. I still think it's a great record. I still think that it has a lot of the charms that M83 have kind of established up to this point in their career, and it has figured out a way of packaging them to be more appealing and more immediate and more focused on beauty than they ever have been. Up to this point in their career, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to the records that immediately precede this, M83 found beauty through these collisions of noise, of heavy walls of noise, with these childlike beautiful melodies and very soothing vocals. It was this clash that kind of intensified both elements of it. But with Saturdays Equals Youth, M83 at this particular point, and again, this is coming right off the back of making Digital Shades Volume 1, Anthony is making a clear choice here, partially, I'm sure, because of the added budget he now has following the success of previous records, to really polish the sound and to actually pare back a lot of the heavy wall of shoegaze guitar kind of aesthetics that had come to define them up to this point. This is much more straightforward synth pop. Songs like Kim and Jesse, songs like Graveyard Girl, songs like the absolutely effervescent We Own the Sky are massive, synth-driven, refined and honed to a T. They are polished, they're beautiful. They do incorporate guitars to a decent extent as well, and it's not like M83 are shifting away from their shoegaze influence entirely here. But they're really 80s sounding drums, but given this additional kind of production slickness that makes it feel really kind of rubbery and tight, like you can bounce off of it, is the most definitive sort of aesthetic aspect of this album, sonically speaking. And it's just a huge shift from what you're used to from M83 up to this point. Having kind of consumed their discography and absorbed it all, and now looking back on it in retrospect, it feels as though while this is a canny move from the perspective of maximizing the appeal of this band as their profile on the radar grows and grows and grows, it does feel as though it's somewhat of a transitional moment that doesn't quite fully realize itself as an album. It starts very strong. It's particularly with Kim and Jesse in the second track spot here. That song is just one of their biggest singles. It's huge. The guitars are gorgeous, and again, there's this blurred line between what's a guitar sound and what's a synth sound. They're all equally soft and pillowy. There's this loudness to them, but there's not an intensity. It's this very beautiful sort of delicate balance. The vocals themselves are so kind of ethereal that they fit perfectly into this mix, and you just kind of have this wall of pretty soft sounds that have this great effect as these songs go on and gather in their intensity. Skin of the Night, the third track, does a similar thing, although it feels a little bit more spacious in the way that it expands as it goes out. It doesn't so much rise in intensity in a linear fashion as much as rise up and then sort of expand outwards. Other songs do that as well, like the Jammy Colors, which is definitely one of the most adventurous tracks here, being more of a kind of progressive electronic jam, mostly instrumental, that just lets Anthony play with dance music in a way that he has flirted with, but hasn't really fully dived into before this point. In fact, this is probably one of the danciest M83 albums. It really has that sense of club readiness that comes through in the percussive aspects as well. Graveyard Girl is it's just one of the most M83-esque songs there can be. And this is another thing that I love about M83, and you've got to kind of buy into this if their music is going to have any appeal to you at all, which is that Anthony is a cheesy bastard. Like, he has this, not only an attachment to nostalgia, but a deep love of it, and a specific connection to the naivety of being a teenager and of having these emotions that feel all-consuming. And there are often moments on just about every M83 record where that will come across in these sort of cutesy approximations of hokey 80s American culture, like film culture, and just this particular dated, very stereotypical and cliched vision of the teenage experience that Anthony really resonates with. And Saturdays Equals Youth feels like a particular record that really emphasizes that, starting with the cloying hipster chic of the almost unbearable artwork. And Graveyard Girl is a song that really kind of leans into this as well, with this basically parodic depiction of this frustrated, gothy, insular teenager who is just straight out of a really cut-rate B-movie teenage melodrama from the 80s. But that's Antony's aesthetic. Like, he finds genuine beauty in that, and I think he genuinely has this love for these cliches and for what they represent. And so a lot of the product of that is leaning into them as hard as possible and turning them up and making them feel even more unreal. The complete beyond the pale embrace of this ridiculous fiction of youth is a fascinating artifact in and of itself, and something that creates a really unique and powerful experience if you can kind of just surrender your tastes to it. And as I've gotten older, I've kind of gotten a little bit more fond of that tastelessness as an aesthetic choice when it's fitting. And that's something that is one of the greatest attributes of M83, and that if you love this band, you love this aspect of them, which is how they can push themselves past the point of tastelessness to this kind of ultimate truth in the cheesy, dramatized elements of the adolescent experience. And that's all over Saturdays Equals Youth. It's just completely there. I mean, I'm saying the title like it's a normal thing you would call an album. It's ridiculous. And as with most things, Antony takes it past the point where it works to the point where it becomes this bleeding, synthetic, alien thing. Saturdays Equals Youth is in some ways one of the more tasteful M83 records. It's got a somewhat comparatively shorter runtime, or at least it feels like it does, because the last track is an 11-minute ambient piece. But, you know, and on the note of that, it kind of does shrug its way toward the finish line a little bit with those last couple of songs. It doesn't really end in any kind of concrete way, and while I like the final ambient piece in and of itself, Midnight Souls Still Remain, I find it very beautiful and calming to listen to. It doesn't really feel like it naturally transitions out of what comes before in any way that I like, and sort of feels as though the album just kind of stops. And so while there are tons of beautiful moments on here, one deep cut favorite I love as well is the very melancholic and beautiful piano driven Too Late. It also is structurally one of the more baffling M83 albums. It doesn't really cohere very much, particularly beyond the halfway point, and sort of leaves you a little bit at a loss as to what you've just experienced, where most other great M83 albums progress and build and then end in a way that feels very purposeful, declarative, and just right when you get there. So despite its flaws, I absolutely recommend Saturdays Equals Youth if that kind of more shinier, peppier, synth-pop influenced 80s sound appeals to you, and if you don't mind a little bit of kitsch, if you don't mind a little bit of cheesiness, absolutely check this album out. It's beautifully produced, it's a very easy listen, and it comes at a particular point in M83's career before the height of their ascendance, where you can really see how much skill and dynamism Antony Gonzalez is able to play with. Number 4, Junk. I know, it's going to be somewhat controversial that I've put Junk over Saturdays Equals Youth, or that I've even put it anywhere above the lowest spot. A lot of people really hate this album, and it certainly is an album that was the victim of a lot of things, some of which were self-inflicted, I think, by Antony, but also some of which have been kind of unfair. And this record's sort of been left in a bit of a strange limbo since it came out in 2016. It hasn't yet been fully re-evaluated, I don't think. It feels like the kind of record that would be ripe for a proper re-evaluation, but it's kind of just sort of been left to sit there. And I don't think that's fair, because while I've had a complicated relationship with Junk over the years, there have definitely been times when I've found it patience trying. If anything, my love and appreciation for what this album is has only grown, and I actually think that, as disagreeable as some of you may find this take, Junk is one of the most well-constructed, cohesive, and satisfying album experiences that M83 have ever put together. It's certainly one of the most unified in its commitment to a particular vision of what it wants to be. The songs suit that vision and are really fun, flavorful, unique, idiosyncratic, and genuinely uplifting, that really do give you a sense of a new playground for Anthony in terms of how he can write, construct, and build songs, the sort of textures he can use, and also taking a lot of his tendencies to their logical endpoint, aesthetically speaking. This is far from the corniest album that they've made lyrically, but it's certainly the most naive and immature, if you like, aesthetically speaking. It very much feels as though it is evoking and even targeting a younger audience with textures that are reminiscent of like 70s and 80s children's TV programming with a lot of particularly corny tendencies. It's interesting to reevaluate Junk and kind of think of it now, approaching it for what it is now that we have some level of being divorced from its release. But at the time when it came out for me in April of 2016, in fact it came out the day before my 19th birthday, and it also came out just a few months after Animal Collective released Painting With, which was kind of like a bellwether record, right? If you hadn't gotten off the Animal Collective train with Centipede Hurts, like a lot of people did, I didn't. If you've watched our Animal Collective video, you'll know that Zach and I are huge and passionate defenders of that record. But even we couldn't get behind Painting With, this kind of cartoonish, underwhelming, condensed vision of some of Animal Collective's most unappealing tendencies to us, some of the most two-dimensional tendencies of what they can do, with a lot of the grit stripped away. And that record was kind of this moment that represented a kind of shift, seemingly permanently, away from the elements within their music that people who came on board with them in the blog era in the 2000s most connected with. But my point being with this entire Animal Collective parallel is that coming just a few months after Painting With, Junk felt at the time kind of like a similar commitment from a band who were just essentially saying at this point, we're done doing the sorts of things that made us famous. We want to explore these much more simplistic landscapes that are based much more around things that interest us and aesthetic palettes that are very different, essentially, from the huge, heavy soundscapes that we cut our teeth on, essentially. And the world as well, and the culture of indie rock and all those sorts of things that, of course, moved a million miles away from bands like Animal Collective and M83. And so Junk exists. And I want to say I think Junk is a great album. It is an album that certainly challenges you as an M83 fan if you're coming at it with a perspective on this project where records like Before the Dawn Heals Us and Hurry Up We're Dreaming, that hugeness of the pop song construction on those albums, if that is the thing that sells you on M83, as it was for me for a long time as well, much of Junk will kind of leave you in the dust. You have these very chintzy, very cute 80s pop tracks like the lead single Do It Try It, the fantastic Go, the sublimely fun Road Blaster and Laser Gun, and you have moments like the Suzanne Sunfor featuring For the Kids and the Beck featuring Time Wind as well, that just explore a different kind of wide-eyed glee that feels like much more of a retreat inward, as opposed to the kind of like larger-than-life IMAX scale vision of the world through the adolescent lens that those previous albums represented. But I've come to really appreciate the more insular viewpoint of Junk. I've come to really appreciate how Anthony scales back his huge swelling post-rock tendencies to deploy them in key moments that make certain songs like Solitude, for instance, feel really impactful, but also to focus within the space of these joyfully tasteless pop songs. You know, it's like the whole album is the saxophone solo from Midnight City, right? The whole album is what would happen if you lived inside a world where full songs were just made with that cheesy grace note perspective, right? That song works on Hurry Up We're Dreaming because it is this cheesy grace note on top of this massive larger-than-life pop song. But what happens when you zero into just the cheesy grace notes and make a whole album about them? And that's what Junk is. It is not going to be for everyone. It's certainly not where I recommend starting if you're new to M83. But if you want to have the sense of sort of traveling into and living inside this very childlike and nostalgic place, Junk may well do wonders for you. It's certainly an album that I think, while not exactly being this massively influential project, it feels ahead of the curve in a lot of respects as well, because it feels like as pop music has leaned further and further into 80s revivalism in the past 6 years, Junk feels very much as though it is the kind of record that is being evoked on, say, the most recent Weekend albums, for instance. So while Junk may feel out of time, it may feel out of step with M83's progression, in some senses it feels logical. It feels like when you take your sound to the brink, as M83 did on Hurry Up We're Dreaming, where do you go from there? You retreat inwards, and those elements that represented the most idiosyncratic aspects of that journey outward suddenly become these little toys that you get to play with in this much more confined and safer space. And that's the space that Junk is best enjoyed in, I think. Number 3. Hurry Up, We're Dreaming. Some people will be surprised to see this album being listed so early already. In fact, I'm surprised this album isn't my number 1, because it feels pretty comfortably like it's the one I've listened to the most. The Hurry Up We're Dreaming double CD has been a fixture of my car stereo for as long as I've had a car, honestly. Every single car I've had, Hurry Up We're Dreaming has been one of the first CDs I play in it. It is perfect journey music, both in the sense that it's perfect music to drive off and have your own little odyssey with, and it's also music that evokes the kind of cheesiness of a band like Journey. Not directly, this doesn't sound like Journey, it's just M83 are pulling from certain points and they're aiming to make this anthemic, huge, larger than life sound that feels so true to really the entire history of popular rock music to some extent, of any kind of music that specifically aims to animate and to speak to young people. Hurry Up We're Dreaming is an album that's absolutely in the lineage of records like Melancholy and The Infinite Sadness, which Anthony has cited as being the most direct influence on this record. He's always wanted to make a double record. He's always wanted to make this huge expansive vision, and with this album he really does explore basically all of the possibilities in terms of what you can do with the double album as a concept structurally. In fact, he kind of does this very satisfying thing where he adheres to this idea of two mirroring halves so closely that each track on each position on the two discs directly mirrors one another. These structural conceits give Hurry Up We're Dreaming the feel of this kind of two-sided odyssey, essentially, this journey through the entirety and to the end of Anthony's fascination with the emotions of youth, with the desire for escape, for adventure, for love and romance and connection and friendship. All of these things which have been individually evoked on every M83 album up to this point, in certain ways, in different ways, often in overlapping ways, yada yada yada. Here, Anthony is laser focused on the absolute final maximalist vision of where those emotions can take you and how those emotions can be evoked purely through music. And this album sounds enormous, frequently enormous. In fact, it almost gets fatiguing by the time you get to the final stretch of the record, and with, amazing songs like Echoes of Mind, for instance, Anthony is still reaching to create these massive, huge, intense blasts of guitar and synth and vocals. And when you're in the mood for being absolutely overwhelmed by that, for being taken through this 2001 A Space Odyssey influenced Stargate journey through the melodrama of adolescence, Hurry Up We're Dreaming feels like the only album that matters while you're listening to it in that headspace. I can't tell you the number of stories I have, of memories I have, of experiences that I have had listening to this album on various road trips with friends, with partners, with people I've been in love with everyone you can imagine that sets foot in my car at some point has to listen to at least some of Hurry Up We're Dreaming. It's just an album that is so tailor-made for that experience. It augments and intensifies every huge, larger-than-life feeling that you have ever had, every desire to essentially transcend the boundaries of where you are in space and time, and in yourself as well. Hurry Up We're Dreaming pulls you out of that. It makes you feel like you're communing with a wall of spirits like yourself who all want to just feel the fire of the sun inside of them. I'm being ridiculous, of course, but it's M83, so I kind of have to be to fully convey how it feels. It's reductive and does a bit of a disservice to the music to call it epic trailer music. Certainly that's how songs like Outro have been used. But it's the kind of music that is purpose-built for that sort of thing. It's purpose-built for that setting and for the format of a thing like a movie trailer, for instance, which is aiming to do the same sort of thing as the music does here, which is create this massive, swelling excitement within you, this desire, this need for connection with something bigger, with a story that's bigger, or just with the inner feeling of wanting to feel completely untouchable. Which is what this album does constantly for its 70-minute runtime. It makes you feel completely untouchable. It is a bit long. It does lean into certain aspects, and after a while it does run that particular goal into the ground a little bit. I still find it easy to listen to from front to back, but it's certainly in its dogged pursuit of being essentially the perfect ideal of the double album, it runs into limitations of what exactly Anthony is interested in doing musically, which is admittedly a fairly small bag of tricks, and in its repetitive mirroring structure, it inevitably does end up recycling ideas between its two halves. So that is one aspect that does hold it back from being the best and fullest realization of what this project is and can be. But at the same time, by the same token, it is still a culmination that feels very satisfying. And of course has songs like Midnight City, has songs like Steve McQueen, has songs like New Map, has songs like Wait. All of these, some of the most enduring, memorable, brilliant, spine-chilling M83 songs, such that if you're interested in getting an idea of this band at all, no matter what you listen to, Hurry Up We're Dreaming has to be on the list. Number 2, Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts. The second M83 album was released in 2003 and marked a huge moment for this project because the first album kind of came and went. It didn't really make very much waves at all, but given the ascendant rise of things like dance punk, of new rave music, of indie tronica, electroclash, all of these sort of underground, very blog friendly things that were starting to bubble up in the early 2000s, M83 were perfectly positioned to deliver a unique statement that would embellish and create their own place within this burgeoning aesthetic of maximalist electronica. And they did that. They did that to great effect with the Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts. It's been described as My Bloody Valentine with synthesizers. It's been given these very clear reference points of classic shoegaze and post-rock. And those attributes and reference points are accurate. This is a post-rock album with huge distorted synthesizers as the primary feature. It is a shoegaze album in the sense that huge distorted synthesizer textures are used in the same way that guitar and guitar effects pedals are used in classic shoegaze records like Loveless, for instance. It's also that kind of record in the sense that it seeks to evoke the same sort of feelings as those kinds of records. Primarily just this overwhelming intensity where you are beaten out of your body by the loudness of the music. And this is a loud record. It gives you a little bit of a moment to ease into it with the opening intro track, Birds, but by the time Unrecorded hits, and basically consistently throughout the runtime of this record, you are getting your shit kicked in by the sheer size of these synthesizer sounds. Now, it is not the most dynamic M83 record as a result of this. In fact, it can be fatiguing in its consistent, perpetual intensity. Not that there aren't some moments where it peers back a little bit, but that's always in service of some new build, essentially towards some new stratospheric heights. And there's only so much that an album can continue to push towards this full full-throated intensity over and over and over again without starting to feel as though it's sort of spinning its wheels a little bit. And I'm sure for some people it does feel that way, but not for me. This album is near perfect, to be honest. The intensity of these synthesizer and keyboard textures, the way that they're used to scale these massive heights, always feels novel, always feels as though fairly consistently throughout the runtime it's being done in a different way, or it's being done through a different lens, or it's being done with its mindset on evoking a different side of its emotional intensity. Run Into Flowers is one of the most iconic M83 songs. It's just a few sort of synthesizer notes that are just looped and given this additional kick by this little percussive rhythm that I love so much, and the song just goes on and on and on and just rises and rises and rises. In Church is maybe one of the most notable here in the sense that it is this wall of synthetic organ sounds. It feels as though you are inside some kind of digital church where layers and layers and layers of massive pipe organs are piling on top of each other and creating this intense, building, transcendent experience that is augmented by these distorted, harsh, buzzing synths that become more and more of a presence as the song goes on. You have other tracks as well that pull similar tricks as well, like Noise, for instance, which, boy, the intensity of this song by the time you reach its peak is barely fathomable. It almost feels as though it collapses inside of itself and leaves behind only its resonances by the time you get to the end of it. You have moments that are more melodic, easier to connect with in that level, like Be Wild, for instance, which I absolutely love. The plaintive, playful, childlike, buzzing synth melody here. You have some points on the record which are just as noisy and ear-scraping as this music can possibly get in songs like America and 007H. And then you have a song like Gone, which is just... I can't tell you how many times I listened to this. I had this thing on a loop as a teenager, listening to these brooding synthetic string sounds, that just this constant string drone that stretches out for 3 minutes as these synthetic drums just pile on top of it. And then eventually you get this little swell and this bit crush, distorted scream as that synth drone explodes into these ascendant, upward flying synthesizer tones. The feeling that gives you is unbelievable. That's the feeling it gives me anyway, and it still has that impact to this day. I still get full body chills listening to the song. I can imagine over the years cumulatively I've probably lost a not insignificant amount of my hearing just from blaring this shit at the highest possible volume while feeling the most 16 years old I have ever felt. It's that kind of album. And as I said, it doesn't have the dynamics to do that in ways that feel as consistently challenging or innovative as other records of theirs. But if you just want that single-minded, focused experience of being completely bludgeoned by the intensity of those emotions, you really cannot get much better than Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts. It absolutely has that same level of impact and aesthetic drive as something like Loveless. You have to be in a similar sort of mindset, I think, to want to put those records on. But when you are in that mindset, they do nothing but augment those feelings and make them feel more vital, more real, more all-consuming. And that's one of the reasons as well that sometimes I hear M83 discussed in, tangentially in emo circles as well. They've never made emo music aesthetically, at least in terms of the conventions of emo and its various waves, but they feel spiritually aligned with a lot of that. And I think that's one of the things that's always connected me to them so much. And maybe even facilitated my own love of emo music, which largely came after I had been an M83 fan. Regardless, that head-crushing feeling is maybe nowhere more fully expressed than in this, the second M83 album. Which leaves us with only one record left to go. Number 1, the best M83 album, Before the Dawn Heals Us. For me, the impetus for making this video in the first place was the moment I had earlier this week when I realized, yeah, this is the best M83 album. And it's funny because I don't think that at any point in my time as a fan of M83 before this week, this album has been my favorite of theirs. The three albums that have been my favorite M83 album at various points in time, the first one was Saturdays Equals Youth, when I was at that kind of 12, 13-year-old age. My second favorite M83 album was Dead Cities, Red Seas and Lost Ghosts, which I discovered as I was getting a little bit older and really just resonated so much with that intensity I was feeling. And then the album that had, for the last several years anyway, been to me the pinnacle of what M83 can do was Hurry Up We're Dreaming. And now we're here, and none of those three records are my number one. So how can I say with any level of confidence that Before the Dawn Heals Us is the best M83 album? Well, I can try my best. And the first thing I have to say as well is that there's no such thing as a perfect M83 album. All of their records are inherently built in with certain limitations. And part of that is what I've mentioned and emphasized a lot in this video, which is the very single-minded focus, aim, and goal of these albums to evoke feelings of being a teenager, of being adolescent, of being in love, of feeling all these emotions and not yet having the maturity, both sort of within yourself and actually like physically, to be able to handle and compartmentalize and deal with those things and be a functioning human being. All of these records are purpose-built for soundtracking, but also facilitating and intensifying those moments where you have no ability to control your emotions at all, where you have no ability to compartmentalize, where you have no ability to even really be rational. That's where M83 come in. They are there to make those moments bigger and sometimes to make those moments exist in the first place if you fully surrender yourself to them. And for me, Before the Dawn Heals Us is the fullest realization of this experience. It takes what M83 are, takes it to some of its most ridiculous extents, takes it to some of its most starry-eyed extents, takes it to some of its noisiest and loudest and most brutal extents, and also weaves in this sort of sublime, ethereal, very simplistic beauty that creates this rich tapestry of every single iteration of what M83 can and have and will do, all within this one piece. Every album I've talked about today, the aesthetic of every album I've talked about today, the specific sonic focus or whatever differentiates them, that defining attribute that makes each M83 album what it is, all of them are here to some degree in this album. It is the most sprawling M83 album. It's the one that goes in the most different directions, almost with a complete disregard for how well it is going to cohere itself. It is an album that is completely unafraid to do things that are just totally embarrassing. And, you know, it has moments as well, like Can't Stop and Car Chase Terror, both of which I'll expound upon in a minute, that are so far beyond the pale into this kind of mawkish, even off-putting intensity of Anthony's Americanized and romanticized view of growing up, that they can be unbearable if experienced in the wrong mindset or if experienced without the patience for that vision. Yet every step of the way, with each decision that is made across each one of these successive tracks, you get a vision of M83 that to me feels unabashedly triumphant. It helps that the first 8 songs, like the first entire half of this record, is genuinely flawless. Like, not just in the sense that I love all the songs, but in the sense that it is a singular construction of music that never loses you, that never drifts into experimentation or into doing things that might risk alienating people who are fans of one particular aesthetic idea within this stretch. If you like one song in the first 8-song stretch, you'll probably like all of them because they're all beautiful in different ways, in resonant ways, in exciting ways. Yeah, there are certainly songs that share attributes. Like, for instance, Asterisk and Fields, Shorelines, and Hunters are both those, you know, shorter, more intense bursts of really noisy, distorted synthesizer that very much feel of a piece with Dead Cities and Red Cities. In fact, Asterisk is basically just America, except a little bit better. But then you have songs like the opener, Moonchild. The way that this song opens, the way this album starts, instantly, within the first second, you're in this pool of gorgeous sounds, these beautifully rippling drums that feel like you're being pulled into this exciting new space, these atmospheric piano sounds, these rich, gorgeous levels of reverb and space, and then, of course, they're tending towards cheesy but still very fitting spoken word vocals as the song just completely erupts into this gorgeous thing. It's unreal. And you get Don't Save Us from the Flames, which is just like instantly feels like one of the most erratic and insane and out of control shoegaze rave songs that you've ever heard in your life. The whole thing does sound like a complete car crash, but cohering that intensity to a pop song format. And of course, this is the first time where you really see that format explored in M83's music. It's probably not explored with more focus than it is on Don't Save Us from the Flames, but you do get songs like the absolutely immortal Teen Angst, which just feels like the final form of that massive wailing guitar sound that they've sought to both create but also evoke with their synthesizers and their records up to this point. And here it's just this lightning rod of energy for 5 minutes. It's like being on fire constantly, and that feeling is so gratifying in this format. But you also get songs like Farewell, Goodbye and Safe, songs which initially when I was younger felt a little bit too kind of corny and maybe even cloying for me. But now when I listen to them as a huge fan of records like Hurry Up, We're Dreaming, they make me weep. Like, they make me just completely melt into a puddle, particularly Farewell, Goodbye, which is just unbelievable. In the Cold I'm Standing as well, this song that just revels in how huge waves of ambient synths can sound when they're just completely turned up to overwhelming levels, and when the vocals themselves kind of completely fight and fail to stay above water in this mix. To later points on the record as well, like the kind of kitschy A Guitar and a Heart, which very much follows the same format of a lot of songs on the previous M83 record, but also in the way in which those ideas have been explored and expanded upon in this album, but just in the context of this like video game style pulse pounding 80s guitar journey. It's just this really cool exploration point. And the interludes on this album are fascinating as well. I've mentioned already that M83 are a band that know how to use interludes to powerful effect, whether it is just bridging between different ideas, such as the way the gorgeous I Guess I'm Floating bridges between Asterisk and Teen Angst. In fact, this is probably the best, at least my favorite, interlude on any M83 album. It's just this gorgeous and sad and melancholic and longing piece of music that absolutely feels like it carries as much weight and intensity and beauty as songs that are 5 times its length on this album do. But you also have the curious stretch in the sort of third quarter of this album where you have tracks like Let Men Burn Stars, Slight Night Shiver, and the, let's say, divisive Car Chase Terror. And this is a really interesting track because on its face, it's probably one of the most unlistenable songs M83 have ever put on an album. Just the incredibly hokey B-movie dialogue, this panicked woman attempting to escape with her daughter and reassure her as they're pursued by some unknown assailant. On paper, it sounds as though it has the potential for this real kind of emotionally impactful, if a little bit out of left field, intensity. But when delivered in this incredibly hokey and terrible acting style, that feels as though it's like aliens or even an AI trying to approximate a realistic delivery of human emotion, it becomes interesting on a different level to me. It becomes a kind of representative moment that feels as though it encapsulates Anthony as this Frenchman who is trying, what he's trying to do across so much of his career, which is evoke this aesthetic, this style, these tropes these traditions, these cliches of American coming of age storytelling. And it's this kind of meta moment where you get a sense of both how intensely connected and focused he is on that aspect of his personality and of his artistic fascinations, but also on how irretrievably distanced he is from it by that cultural boundary. It's just something that you watch someone try to approximate something from a world that's entirely different to your own, and their failure to do that, the obvious distance, the obvious difference, it augments and makes even more emotional the attempt in the first place. And while I don't exactly enjoy listening to Car Chase Terror, it's a moment that, through that lens anyway, of this person who is attempting to express the intensity of their feelings and of their connection to a culture outside of their own, is failing, but failing in the most fitting way possible, in the most dedicated way possible, only makes the experience feel truer to what M83 are all about, to what M83 have always done, to what the appeal has always been. And it's not just that the appeal is someone trying to assimilate themselves into a culture that they don't come from, but that they feel an affinity towards. It's also a microcosm for the relationship of a fully grown adult with their own childhood nostalgia, right? That attempt to connect with a feeling, with a state of mind, with a state of being when you were an age that you will just never be again, and that you can never really actually truly be embodying again. You know, as much as we connect ourselves to nostalgia, as much as we can use nostalgia as a crutch, as much as nostalgia can be the source of some of our strongest emotions and some of our most sort of brutal emotional experiences as adults, it's always going to be this false thing. It's always going to be this thing that is always just an approximation, that we always have a distance from, that is never really real. And the more that you look at it and the more you investigate your own nostalgia, the more unreal, the more fake, the more obviously broken it is. And that doesn't stop us from connecting with or having a relationship with our own nostalgia, or even pursuing it to the point of trying to recreate our childhood and our childhood feelings at any cost whatsoever. But it can be the source of some of the most gratifying feelings ever. Because probing nostalgia and spending time in a nostalgic space and exploring and wanting to embody within ourselves as adults those feelings that felt so mundane and even exhausting to us as teenagers, that can be a gratifying pursuit. That can be a pursuit that brings us real joy. And that's what M83 is all about, right? It is about the pursuit of the gratification within nostalgia, of the gratification within our memories, of the space within our brains, and of our brains' ability to create a haven for ourselves in a past that may be realistic or may be completely fictionalized or reimagined if our actual childhood and our actual growing up is something that isn't pleasant to us or something that we aren't able to connect to all that easily. The feelings and the journey towards that place can be something entirely fictionalized. And it feels very fictionalized in the M83's music. It feels as though Anthony is not necessarily trying to relive his own childhood and adolescence, although I don't know what that was like for him, but it feels as though he is deliberately trying to create a false and ridiculous and extreme one. You know, that's something that is part of the reason why all of their records appeal so much. Even Junk, and maybe Junk more so, because it's just more honest about the ridiculousness of that pursuit. But just because a pursuit is ridiculous doesn't make it not worth it, doesn't make it not meaningful, doesn't make it not beautiful. And all of their silliness, and all of their excess, and all of their frequently hard on sleeve to the point of ridiculousness moments, M83 continually deliver that feeling. And that's what makes them one of my favorite bands ever, certainly a band that have always meant a lot to me ever since I discovered them as a kid, and a band that feel so significant within the last 20 years of music, both within those halcyon days of, glitchy electro clash new rave electronica that they came up in to that stratospheric, massive pop landscape of the 2010s that they melded themselves within, shaped with records like Hurry Up We're Dreaming and Junk, and then retreated from into nascent worlds of pure revisionism. That's M83. That's what I think about M83 anyway. That's what I think about their albums. You have to forgive me if this was a little bit waffly and pretentious. I'm going to allow myself a little bit of pretension in the context of talking about M83 in particular, but please do let me know what you think of these records, what you think of my analysis of them and of M83 in general in the comments below. I'm going to put up on my screen now a list of my favorite M83 songs as well, so that you can get an idea for, if you haven't already, what the real highlights were if you want to dip your toes into particular tracks as well. And I do think that's definitely a valid way of testing the waters with M83 because they have some amazing songs. But to recap, if you want to actually get into M83 and you're looking for records to get started with, I absolutely recommend Hurry Up We're Dreaming and Before the Dawn Heals Us. I think those two are the most perfect starting points. But equally, if you want something a little bit more polished and to the point and a little bit less kind of skyscraping and overwhelming, Saturdays Equals Youth could definitely be your bag. If you're more into that kind of proto distorted lo-fi electronics, definitely check out Dead Cities, Red Cities, Lost Ghosts. And if you like the idea of exploring these kind of corny, forgotten aesthetics of 70s and 80s electronica and specifically children's TV and video game music, check out Junk as well. And Digital Shades Volume 2 as well, because that definitely brings in a little bit more video game music influence too. Anyway, that's all I have to say about M83 for today. More than enough. Please make sure you stick around for when Fantasy releases next month and we do review it on the show. Can't wait to see how that record turns out. Really liked the single and I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion about it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Both of those things help us out a lot and let us know that you do want us to keep doing these sorts of things and making these different kinds of videos as well. If there's something in particular you want us to do, let us know in the comments below, but also know that if you hit the join button for $1 a month, you can become a member of the Jams and Tea family, get your name in the title crawl of every video on this channel, plus you can decide what we listen to by having first pick, essentially, getting to recommend us something that will go to the top of our listening list. As always though, folks, until next time, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Fisher Price, live, laugh, grow.